Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Network Collective. Network Collective is a live stream video roundtable discussion where network engineers from all walks get together, talk about the topics of the day. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the increased pervasiveness of encrypted traffic on our networks and what that means to us personally as it relates to privacy and also as it relates to us as we manage the networks we're responsible for. Before we jump into the topic today, I want to say hello to those who are watching us live on our YouTube live stream. If you are watching the show there, you can use the hashtag Network Collective on Twitter. We're watching that. We'd love to have your contributions, your comments, your questions, and we'd love to integrate them into the show as we can. So to help us in this conversation today, we have two very talented guests. These are people who are very experienced in network security, and I'd like to have them introduce themselves. So we're going to start off with Brandon Carroll.
Hey there. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. Brandon Carroll, you can find me at globalconfig.net or nowadays datanetworkingtalk.com and on Twitter at Brandon Carroll.
All right. Thanks, Brandon. Also joining us is Katherine McNamara.
Yeah, I'm Katherine McNamara, network-node.com, and on Twitter, KMCNAM1. That's not the easiest one to remember, but hopefully the recording will help. Yeah, thank you.
All right. So in that vein, if you want to find information on how to connect with any of us, there's profiles on all of our guests and our hosts on thenetworkcollective.com. So you can go there and learn a bit more about who we are and where you can find us and chat. So joining our guests, we have our other co-hosts of the show. So we have Phil Gervasi and Yvonne Sharp and myself, Jordan Martin. Let's dive in. Let's start with the very first question I want to get to, and it's fairly simple. Do you agree with the premise of the show? Do you agree that we're seeing more encrypted traffic on our networks? And if so, what do you think some of the causes of that might be? And if you don't, well, what are you seeing that I'm not seeing? So, let's start there.
Well, I think obviously we're seeing more and more encrypted traffic. I mean, even blogs are moving towards encrypting traffic. Is it a good and bad thing? Yes. Increased privacy, less, man in the middle, or interception, risk of interception on big wide world internet, but also visibility challenges. A lot of it's very expensive to decrypt traffic. Being able to do things like sd-wan, where you have to be application aware to know which traffic is critical or not, becomes a little bit more difficult. So there's a lot of things you kind of have to think about whether you want to decrypt, or if you can't decrypt, how do you still maintain some semblance of visibility?
That's a good point, because that there's an increase of encrypted traffic on our network, right? We already got that, and we agree. But how are we handling that now, and how is that changing the way that we deal with those technologies that are maybe very new? Like SD-WAN isn't necessarily brand new, but it's becoming much more prolific and ubiquitous on our networks, and that poses a problem. When you especially incorporate the SD-WAN and the WAN-op components, and maybe you have to break encryption at some point, to dedupe packets or whatever you're doing. So how are we handling it is another question.
What I've seen, really about 60 to 70% of all the traffic on our networks is encrypted in some form. That's a combination of either VPN or just HTTPS web traffic. And there are risks with that, but there's also huge challenges with trying to unpack that payload and figure out what's in there. So.
Yeah. I think it's true. We are seeing this big increase in encrypted traffic, but I think part of that stems from, for so long we've taught people that if you want your traffic to be private, you got to encrypt it, and now we're encrypting anything that doesn't need to be encrypted. So you pile that on top of stuff that really should be encrypted, and it's just going to continue to increase. Everything, encrypt all the things now is kind of what everybody does.
Can you flesh that a little bit? What specifically doesn't need to be encrypted then?
Well, so on
Getting called out.
Well, like
On the spot.
news sites,
Not a call
right?
out.
Like news sites,
I'm
informational sites, anything that I mean, you can do authentication on an encrypted channel, but you don't have to share all the content in a way that's encrypted. But I think just from an ease of configuration, ease of use, and not even really use, but it's easier to just have it all on or all off, I think.
Yeah.
And then we had the Firefox Facebook issue a few years ago, where if you were on the same wireless network as somebody, Facebook used to authenticate via HTTP, and you could steal people's credentials and grab their session. And I think really when that happened, that's really when we started to see a huge change in how web services started dealing with their traffic. They just started encrypting all of it.
Yeah. I think, like Katherine mentioned, that even blogs are encrypted now, right? So if I'm reading a blog, I have to have an encrypted session to that site just to read a blog. I
actually I had this conversation with somebody I know. He was starting a security blog, and it was just going to be his thoughts on security in general. And one of the cool things he thought he was going to do was, I'm going to smack a SSL cert on it and just force everyone to encrypt. Big thing I mentioned to him is, it's a new blog. Attackers like to hide malware in encryption. And most of the time, people are not going to want to pay to decrypt. So they're probably going to block some low reputation or brand new blog rather than allow it to just go through, because it looks, like the URL just looks kind of safe, or might not be an accident. So you may inadvertently get yourself blocked by some like corporate censors or corporate proxies and stuff, because they'd rather not waste the money and the cycles on decrypting your little blog. So that is something to be aware of if you're a content producer out there and you're trying to give free content away. If you encrypt your stuff just for the sake of encrypting, expect yourself to get blocked. I've seen especially governments like in DoD contractors, they'll block even unencrypted blogs if they're not, they don't even have like any sort of reputation. So if you want more exposure, or if you think that you have to do SSL certification or certs, don't unless you're actually having anything logged in, or you don't need, or if you're trying to prevent a replay attack or something.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, right? Because I know it technically. I mean, people in the technical community have been aware of encryption and want to see more and more things encrypted. I think in the past couple of years, there's been an increased awareness because of some of the leaks that have happened that have come out of some of our intelligence agencies. I've just seen hyper awareness when we found out that Google was owned not between me and Google, but inside Google's stuff, right? Like and there was just all this eavesdropping going on, and now I think every service is going that way. Even services that don't need to, just for the sake of that. There's a lot of people who just want privacy when they're browsing the web, and when we talk about what should we encrypt and what shouldn't we encrypt? Part of that equation, though, is some of the heuristics about the things that you visit. It's not just about the content. Yes, I want my banking information encrypted, and yes, I want my medical records encrypted, but I also don't want people snooping in on just the random stuff that I do every day to get a profile for who I am. And I feel better when there's not someone in the middle. I don't trust my ISP, right? I just don't. I don't trust my ISP to not be building a profile on me, and so I feel better when that's encrypted and they can't see the data. Sure, they can see I go there, right, but they can't see what's going on. And so I think there's that. I think that's making it more into the mainstream than what it's been in the past. I think people are starting to recognize the value of that metadata, and beyond the metadata, the actual data. And so taking all the steps that you can to try to avoid that.
I did hear somebody say not that long ago, I made that same argument with regard to SD-WAN, but in any case, the reply was, well, if you can't trust your ISP, who can you trust? And my answer was, nobody.
Yeah,
the answer is nobody.
Don't trust anybody, but if that's your bar for trust, man, I feel really bad for you.
Yeah, I strongly disagree with that.
Well, look at what people are doing with things like TunnelBear and these other services, right? They don't trust their ISP, or they want to get, television streamed from a different country, right? So you get these VPN services.
I've never done that.
You want to you get this VPN service from somebody that, how do you trust them? So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's some level of implicit trust of whoever's providing the services, but at least you get to choose them, unlike ISPs where, your physical location tends to determine what ISPs you have available to you.
Yep.
Yep. So from the perspective of like end user, I mean, honestly, I wouldn't want anyone snooping in on what I necessarily Google or something. Not because I Google anything too naughty or anything like that, but you can learn a lot about somebody just from their web searches. So I'm glad as a consumer, those things are encrypted by Google or Yahoo or whoever you're using as a search engine. Ask Jeeves, whatever. But from a business perspective,
She said it.
I know I went
That's
old
a way
school.
back. That's yeah.
That was very nice. Yes.
Yeah, I like that.
I'm pretty
fist
sure it's
bump.
still out there, right? Someone just bought it or
I
something
think it's
like that.
just Jeeves now.
Is it Jeeves?
Yeah,
Okay, sorry.
yeah.
That's a rabbit,
They're making
rabbit
it
trail. We
hip.
don't
They got
need to
rid
go
of the
down.
ask. Kind of like MySpace is still out there, but nobody remembers that old profile that still exists. No, from a consumer point of view, like at my home, I like the fact that more things are encrypted. From a administrative engineer business perspective, that I have to manage that traffic, it's a nightmare because if you have applications or software services on the internet that are going to be encrypted, I mean, it becomes a little bit more manual and resource intensive to actually keep track of all those things because you've got the option to decrypt to discover what's inside that. And from a security perspective, that's really good, but it's expensive and there's a lot of caveats to make that work correctly without jeopardizing the user experience. The other alternative to that is statically kind of pinning services to IP addresses, either on the internet or internally, what you're, mapping your applications that way. And that's a way of doing it as well. But if someone adds a server in there or adds a new service on top of that server, you're going through and having to make more changes to say prioritize that kind of traffic or with your sd-wan or whatever it is. So it's not being decrypted but it's still being prioritized. That's the way I see it, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a good segue to the next part of the conversation, right? We've been managing our networks primarily with the idea that we have visibility into most of the things that go through, and the things that we don't have visibility to, I don't really want to know anyway. Like, I don't want to know, the employees of my company's bank records, and I don't want to know their medical records. Like, that's stuff that can be encrypted, and I don't need to touch that, right? But now it's coming down to web searches, and it's coming down to using encrypted proxies to bypass filters, and now all of a sudden there's this continued growth of a need for visibility into that traffic. So what type of tools do we have? I mean, so what are the things now in our arsenal when we're looking at trying to manage networks with encrypted traffic on them, and we're coming from a assumed unencrypted to an assumed encrypted world? Like, what can we do? What's out there?
So
I mean, you mentioned some of them, right? You said IP pinning, so we could not analyze beyond layer 4. Like, we can just say this particular site, good or bad, that's it.
Yeah.
I was looking at that from the perspective of like SD-WAN. You also have the option to decrypt, and you should be still, even if you're decrypting, you should be selective, because if you throw all your traffic and decrypt all of it, there's going to be stuff that doesn't decrypt easily, or you have to inherently have a certificate trusted on that endpoint to bypass some of that certificate pinning. And for anyone who doesn't know this, if you're decrypting traffic in between you and Google, for example, and you're using Chrome, your Chrome has a certificate pinned in there that says this is Google's certificate. So if you try to decrypt that without having a trusted certificate in between that your computer has already enabled to allow that decrypting, it's going to fail. And so there's a user experience aspect where you have to make sure everyone has a certificate that can, that way it's trusted when you break that. You essentially have a tool, SSL decryption or appliance or a firewall doing that decrypting for you. Or you should be very selective. You can be selective about what you're decrypting and make sure that it's only the stuff that looks high risk or important, like, based on reputation or based on certain sites that are more important to you, and kind of leave the rest as kind of like the do not care and just let it through or block it straight away. if you try to decrypt everything, legal issues may ensue, depending if you're like in the EU or you're decrypting someone's banking statement. Like first time you decrypt the CEO's banking records, you're going to probably have some issues.
Or anybody's for that matter.
I think it's important to talk about what we do with that traffic once we decrypt it, right? I mean, why are you decrypting it? What tools are you using? Are you encrypting it because you want to see if there's malware in there? Are you encrypting it for data loss prevention? That's going to really affect your strategy for decryption and what tools you use to do that. I mean, you have to know the why before you just, well, if I decrypt the traffic, it helps. Well, not unless you have tools to actually analyze that traffic and do something with it.
Yeah,
that's a great point.
Yeah. Before we keep saying decryption, and I think that all of us on this call know what we're talking about here, but I think we probably should take a minute to talk about what that means, right? We're talking about what is known as a man-in-the-middle attack on SSL or TLS, right? So we traditionally when you connect to a server and encryption is involved. The client, the browser negotiates with the server. They agree on a set of ciphers, and it's encrypted from the browser all the way to the server. I'm being probably a bit oversimplistic in the explanation, but generally that's what's happening. So for anyone in the middle to be able to see that traffic, we have to break that connection between the client, the browser, and the server. And so we're talking about a box that sits in the middle, and when it sees that traffic, returns a spoofed certificate to the client, and then initiates its own session to the web server, establishing its own, TLS or SSL connection to that server. And in between those 2 points where it decrypts it, or where it presents the spoof certificate to the client, and the point where it goes from that box to the server, it's unencrypted. And now we can do something with that traffic. We can look at it, we can modify it, we can make some decision about it. And we've used this, for a long time, right? We've had proxies that have done this, and we've had, these web filters and even some of the next-gen firewalls that have done this for some time. And generally it's been, I think it's kind of been ignored in our environment. But there was just in March, I think, US CERT came out with an advisory saying, hey, wait a minute, when you do this, it really impacts the security of that connection. And it has to do a lot with how that middleware, that middle box, is handling that encryption and decryption, whether or not it passes back certificate validation errors. And so, this is one of those things that I don't know how many places we want to be doing this. I guess this is kind of my point. Is I think we need it, right? We need places where we can decrypt the traffic and make decisions about it. But it seems like everybody wants to do it now. It's not just at the edge, at the internet edge, where it used to be, where it was a web proxy and that's it. Now we're talking about SD-WAN, and we're talking about that at every branch.
And visibility.
Having the ability and visibility. And so we're building these things where we can build these application, aware policies and trying to distribute them everywhere. How many places do we want to be breaking this traffic and standing in the middle? I think it's something that maybe we should talk about.
Here's why I don't think it would be plausible to do that decryption in a large environment, especially with SD-WAN. Cha-ching. That's going to be a lot of money.
Sure.
It's not cheap.
That would require pretty much either a beefy enough firewall to do that decryption, or SSL appliances at every single branch if you're doing SD-WAN with a direct internet handoff. I think that I don't think I've run across any companies that are doing that. And kind of going back to your point, Jordan. The why is important as well. But realistically, SSL decryption used to be a lot easier. It was a lot different. It's still expensive, but we have more and more complex ciphers these days. And even with decryption, it's the way that's like quick, where there's multiplexing, where packets are being sent sent at faster speeds, but it's not even when it's decrypted, it's not as easy for an IPS to piece things together. So even from a security perspective, I do think that even decryption isn't going to help us for much longer, or at least keep helping us or be as effective. We're going to get things that we can't decrypt, and we got to be prepared for that. From a securities perspective, we're going to have to start looking at other avenues. I mean, I think that in the past it was slap an AV on an endpoint and call it a day, and just put all these different like put a beefy firewall or an IPS and we're good. I think that we have to like start looking at beefing up and hardening the endpoints, but also kind of looking at like the analytics of how data moves around the network, because it's not only like you may not know what's in the packet, but if you see that in your logs that somebody downloaded a 20 gig proprietary file, and then suddenly you see that they uploaded 20 gigs to box, you couldn't break the encryption, but you know that 20 gigs went up to box. It's fairly easy to know that it's to guess at least that this might have been that file that was being pushed up to someone's personal box account or something along those lines. So looking at that will at least help us know that even if we can't decrypt it, we know that something might be going on from a security perspective. From an SD-WAN side, it gets a little more difficult. I don't know if anybody that's decrypting just for the purposes of being able to optimize SD-WAN, and that also seems pretty expensive to do. I'll kind of throw it back on anyone else.
I can tell you they're doing it.
They're all pitching it. Like just about everybody is pitching this idea of application awareness. I mean, that's really one of the big selling points of SD-WAN.
They're pitching the application awareness, but are they pitching decrypt everything?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily decrypt everything. Decrypt via policy. Okay. But of course, the unwritten statement in that decrypt via policy is the fact that the more you decrypt, the more you're going to be able to apply policy and make decisions about where things are going. And so, I mean, this conversation is not happening in the SD-WAN sales pitch. Let's just put it that way. Like the cost and the impact to performance and all the implications of this man in the middle type approach to decrypting SSL. They just say they can, and they do. So you can do this thing. And so I think that we're going to start seeing, as people start rolling it out, that there's a real impact.
I would like to add that some people are having those conversations, and they are...
it's not everybody.
Yeah, no, but I say that only to say that it's the result is it elicits a second conversation with the chief security officer and some other people that are trying to put out the fire that you started. So
for sure.
They don't want to talk about it.
Yeah. I want to go back to just for a minute the conversation about the decryption for security tools, right? Mm-hmm. Send that traffic to a security tool. And then I think about how in the past we would always talk about, I mean, for years teaching IPS courses and how, we want to get traffic that we can see through that IPS because it's inline and it can find all this good stuff. But I mean, the truth was that they couldn't necessarily keep up with emerging threats. Right? They're always struggling to stay up to date with, 0-day attacks coming out, things along those lines. I don't think that's changed now. I think it's getting more and more difficult to stay current with these 0-day attacks. And so the argument of decrypt everything because we want to send it to our security tool to be filtered, I just don't think that stands as much now as maybe 10 years ago when we want to send something through an IPS. I think it's even worse now. So like Katherine said, we've got to be looking at other things that we can do, the data analytics and figuring out what people are doing. That was a great example of you downloaded a 20 gig file and now you sent 20 gigs to the box. What was that? And then, throw on top of all of that your DNS resolution and what kind of things you're looking up before you make these connections. I think we got to be looking at that because I think, just trying to take clear text, take something, decrypt it, and then send it through a tool. You got to pay for the tool. You got to keep that tool updated. And at the same time, you're paying big bucks for these appliances that are trying to decrypt all this traffic too.
Yeah. Right. I mean, there's a scaling issue there, right, as well, because you're creating a bottleneck. And it's always been true. An IDS, IPS that sits in line, a firewall, anything that's centrally, we funnel everything here, and then this thing has to handle all of our traffic. Well, as bandwidth and throughput increases, Those boxes have to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they just haven't scaled at the same rate that throughput has. I want to talk, because we're talking about heuristic analysis of traffic, and a lot of this comes back to knowing your environment. Like you have to be able to establish what normal is before you can tell the variations from normal. Now, there's some really clear, obvious variations from normal. If you're sending that 20 gig file to China and you have no business partners or anything in China, alert. That's a really easy thing to identify as, hey, this may be a thing. But I think heuristics it's always had this, catching the big stuff is possible, but catching some of the more nuanced things has always been a difficult thing. Like, I don't think heuristics is ever going to get to the point where it in itself is a solution that tells us everything that we need to know. I mean, because the idea is that baseline, there's some variability on the baseline always. And so, a 20 gig file that you download and then 20 gigs up the box doesn't necessarily indicate something bad, right? But if you alert on every time that happens, you're going to just get alert fatigue, right? Like eventually you just say,
but that's
I can only check so many things.
But that's why somebody needs to manage that expertly. I mean, you're right. There's alert fatigue, but if you manage your baselines, you know what your baselines are, and heuristics is adding some sort of intelligence there. So there's definitely cost associated with it. So this isn't just a cheap alternative, but somebody who's about to leave the organization, HR sends IT that email, and it's cool how we get to know that before they do, right?
No, I don't like knowing that.
I'm not saying that I take special pleasure in knowing that, but I take special pleasure in knowing that. Somebody needs to deactivate his AD account, and all of a sudden it's okay. So let's do that prior to him grabbing all that intellectual property off of the file share. So obviously there are those glaring examples, but the way that technology is going right now, looking at host to host intra LAN traffic and pushing all that down to the endpoint, like Katherine was talking about, and being able to say, okay, peer to peer, why are we moving these files over here? Let's not allow that to happen. Why are we allowing these executables to run when they shouldn't be? Things like that. So, I think that's definitely the direction that we're going. It's not really an encryption conversation more than or as much as it is a security in depth conversation, right? So
I think it's that. I think heuristics is an add-on. Right? It's another piece. It's another way
layer
to identify information. Mm-hmm. I think it becomes more necessary because of the encryption conversation. I think it's why we're talking about it.
And I don't want to turn into an advertisement for any specific product, so I'm not going to mention any product names. But
I'm thinking of one.
Yeah, I'm not going to, because to be fair, this is not my job or my workplace. And so I'll just simply say blanket, there are ways and tools out there that they don't look just for like one single upload or download, but like a combination of things, like baselining over like a 30-day period. You're usually like, this user is usually in from 9 to 5, and then suddenly, Jordan, I'm picking on you. Jordan logs in at 2 in the morning, and then Jordan's usual east to west traffic from servers to his PC is 50 megs. Suddenly he's downloading 50 gigs at 2 in the morning. So like things where it looks at like demerit points and adds up like, hey, these are a lot of unusual things. Maybe Jordan's just working late and has a deadline and he's just downloading a bunch of stuff to his house because he's doing something legitimate, or maybe someone from Russia stole his credentials and is going crazy and stealing proprietary data. But at least like looking at a combination of things, and these systems out there that these tools are getting smarter and smarter. So while they still have kind of a certain thing where a threshold they alarm on, the behavioral baselining based on user and their specific behavior added on with specific thresholds, if you always want to be alerted if more than 5 gigs goes to the internet from one specific host, those kind of things can trim down on some of that alert fatigue, and at least give you a better, clearer view of what's normal for Jordan versus some guy who works in marketing.
Sure. Yeah.
I think one of the things that we need to think about though is security is a multi-pronged endeavor. And I think for a long time, and the security sales industry is probably worse about this than anything. There's a big breach that happens, and then all of a sudden you get an email from every security vendor that says, we could have stopped the security popular breach of the day.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, exactly. The word wasn't coming to me. But we have to, as practitioners, have a strategy and understand where the products fit into our environment and into our overall security strategy. And that has to include the endpoint. It has to include the network. Flow data is incredibly valuable from a security standpoint. And we have to combine all those tools to help build a decent security practice. And as network engineers, we're just a small piece of that puzzle. And I think we have been sold like, here, put this box in, send all your traffic through it, and you're A-OK. I mean, we've got a firewall, we've got IPS, but nobody has looked at that IPS and the alerts in 5 years, and it's so behind on updates that the hardware won't even run it now. But we've checked our compliance box, so we're okay.
Right.
And I think that is the big challenge in a lot of our large organizations. Not all of them, but some of them that don't take their security practice maybe as seriously as they should.
Yeah, we're sort of taking a little bit of a turn here and talking about the philosophy of security, right? That endeavor or that paradigm. But you're right. Compliance, I think, drives quite a bit of that. So what boxes do I have on my network? And, certain C-level people might think, okay, just buying this next box will give us the security that we need to check those compliance boxes. And here's the thing. Often they do. You just need to say, I have an IPS IDS appliance on campus. Just needs to be on, in a rack somewhere, and you can check the box. We're good. Oh, it's going to cause downtime? Yeah, but as long as it's in, it's good. So just plug it in literally, and we're not lying to our regulatory bodies. So I'm sorry to go negative. but on the other side, on the other side of that, it does drive what ciphers we're using, where we are able to encrypt and decrypt when we have to promise to a particular customer that we're providing end-to-end encryption between point A and point B. So a lot of that design, going back to encryption, but also the layers of security that we have in our enterprise, is driven by those compliance requirements. At least it has been in my experience, in my couple of years experience in enterprise IT, and even back when I was a consultant. So sometimes that's more frustrating than anything else, but that's been my experience there.
I often feel very nihilistic when it comes to security. I really do. Like I look at security. Yeah. And so when I say that, and actually, I'm going to bring this back to a paper I was reading and preparing for this show. Even when you do it right, even when because you guys are talking about organizations that don't really take it seriously, and they absolutely exist. I've worked in them. I see them regularly. They just want to check the box and that's it. But even for organizations that are doing it right, this is the type of stuff that scares me. So this came from a paper called "The Security Impact of HTTPS Interception," and this was university type study, kind of joined in with people from some major cloud providers, those types of things. And in there, what they found is specifically about these boxes that were acting as proxies, pretty much these ones that do HTTPS interception and whatever. 11 out of 12 significantly reduced the security of your traffic if you had them in their default configurations. 11 of 12
they
of the ones they looked at. They decreased because they used less secure ciphers, or they didn't validate certificates and pass them back to the end user. 11 out of 12 is what they found. Five of them had what they considered critical or secure vulnerabilities, as in they offered encryption that had been known to be broken. Yeah. And so the session between the box and the browser, this middleware box and the browser would be fine. It would be some sort of encryption that was well known and established because the browser had abandoned that type of cipher for a very long time. Yeah. But they then were establishing connections with web servers with export grade encryption, like stuff that has been, we haven't used in years. And by default, they are willing to accept a connection like that. So man in the middle was trivial. It was absolutely trivial to stand in the middle between the middleware box and the server, because the encryption ciphers are well known to be broken, and there are tools to do it, and they're susceptible to vulnerabilities. That's 5 out of 12 of the major players. I mean, this is in their default configurations. And so even boxes that you put in and you set up the policies, I mean, if you don't understand down to the cipher level of what's being done and vary from what the vendor has given you as, their default, you're making yourself more vulnerable by running it than less vulnerable. And this was the whole backing for this whole U.S. CERT, announcement that, hey, like HTTP interception may not be, the best thing since sliced bread or whatever. And so like this is the type of stuff that makes me. So when I say I'm somewhat nihilistic about security, it's like it just seems like something you can't win. I mean, yes, that's why you have depth, and that's why you have all these components. And I know we have a couple of people who've invested a lot of time into security, so I apologize if I'm stepping on your toes. But in that, I look at this and this makes me depressed. Like like these boxes, like I expect more out of our vendors, and unless these customers who are buying these products are validating, like not just installing it and installing it based off the best practices that the vendor is saying, but actually validating what they're doing, they'd have no idea.
It makes me feel like chasing your tail, right?
Yeah.
Like you're just, because you can't trust that the vendors gave you good policies. You can't trust that your service provider's not doing something they shouldn't. You can't trust that, the organization is implementing the security tools the way that they're supposed to and not just ticking off a box for compliance. So it's like, who wins here?
The sales guys. The sales guys.
The unfortunate part is, so I was, after this WannaCry stuff happened, there was a lot of similar upset on LinkedIn about like, everybody's calling me, every security vendor's calling me saying that they could have prevented this, but none of them will sign 100% guarantee. And one guy who worked at a different security vendor smartly said, oh, I can give you a guarantee, but you have to write me a guarantee that you're going to patch it, keep it up to date, upgrade, make sure you follow best practices, and someone's going to be checking the logs. And the guy just didn't say a word back. The reality is, default settings, I do agree that all vendors, my own included, should be holding to a better standard, not just putting the easy button on just because they know it'll work. But also from a perspective of operational handoff, like I've seen people brag about like, hey, look look at my uptime on my firewall. It's been up for 8 years. Wait, that's 8 years without an update. What the hell? That's not something to brag about. How's that heartbleed going? And shell shock. Like, it's terrifying because it's the edge device. Like I've seen large financial institutions still have PIX firewalls at the edge. I mean, to some degree, I think that all across the board, security from the operations or whoever's owning it in the organization needs to kind of be well read and researched, because you're right. You can't just read, take it out of the box and pretend like it's all good because that's the vendor settings. And from the vendor side, you should be putting it a little high, raising the bar a little to make sure that it's that you aren't just giving them the easy settings that works for everything, but it's going to be massively compromise themselves. They shouldn't have to make 20 different changes just to make it semi-secure. So I agree on that point.
Well,
you can look at that another way.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Brandon, please.
No, sorry. I just thinking you could look at that too as maybe the vendor had a product that they shipped with settings that are vulnerable, and that was 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and now there's been updates that fix it, but you haven't updated it. So now whose fault is it? It's not the vendor's fault for shipping something that at the time was considered to be strong enough. So,
well, I was thinking of a YouTube video on a certain firewall that it was the big thing on YouTube years ago, but basically they took it out of the box and they were able to it was a competing vendor, and they were able to bypass like with 99 like different bypasses on like using an old tool. And the other vendor was like, because vendor wars, other vendor was like, well, you didn't implement this big long list of best practices we had. And they were like, well, does every customer read that big long like 20-page list of like things that you have to set to before it's like decently secure to like and immune to like 10-year-old software? I would venture to say most people don't. They're given a project saying go implement this firewall. They're not sitting there reading, okay, what IPS signatures do I have to? I mean, in a perfect environment, you have a security team and a network team working well together and making it extremely granular. But every environment I've worked at and most of the people I work with are usually stretched really thin, and they're trying to move from project to project. And I mean, you guys can tell me, do you guys have too much time at work to here on this call to go and tune everything and make things work even better and constantly update stuff?
I just thought it was funny when you said the word security team. I was like, what is that?
What is that? Yes.
I mean, there are even very large organizations
Well,
that don't
it's a
have
mythical
that,
thing some people have.
but it
out
is.
there.
But
mythical.
it's mythical.
Unicorns.
This is but that's the sexy thing right now, you know. Security is hot on the news, and therefore it's top of mind for C-level folks that aren't technological or into technology. And so, you know, the number of people that are, or the organizations that never had a CIO now have CIOs, that never had a CISO now have a CISO, C-level person, and looking at information security. So, you know, I think there is still there's a change that's happening where there's more serious thought given to looking at security as a, you know, like Yvonne said, a multi-pronged beast. Is that what you said? Something like that.
I don't think I used the word beast, but I may have said
approach.
A
multi-pronged.
multi-pronged endeavor,
Yes.
right? Because in my experience
I can
now,
say it's a
focusing a
beast.
little bit more on security in my job, you know, having a network engineer background, that's what I am primarily, but I'm looking at security a lot more these days. You got to have your hand in everything, from compliance regulations and understanding, like the, you know, having read through like the NIST documents, through you know, Homeland Security stuff, and then also just how packets flow on a network, to knowing how group policy works, and understanding, you know, and you know, how do I authenticate BGP. So there's all these different, you know, the multi-prong that Yvonne was talking about. So it's hard, and so, you know, that it doesn't lend itself to just, first of all, just having a box being put in, and then having a team to be able to do that. You're talking about, I think, in my opinion, some seriously talented people, and talented people are very expensive.
We touched on. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
One thing I also think is there's a little bit of a, when it comes to security, there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes between operations folks and management, like on the true cost, on how important it is. So I was after that WannaCry weekend, I was actually in one of my, you know, networking chat rooms, and some guy from an MSP was like, they're never going to learn that it's more expensive. It's more expensive to be preventative. I mean, that's why companies have insurance. And you know, I whenever people tell me like, what about Home Depot and Target, I just tell them, when was the last time you shopped there? And of course, everybody has. And you know, I piped in. I was like, look, you know, from your perspective, people still shop there, so therefore they didn't lose money. But here's some news articles showing that even though insurance paid $100 million of the losses for Home Depot, they still had to cough out $91 million. Or with Sony, you know, insurance covered, you know, $100 million or so, but they still had to pay $63 million. How much of, you know, would you say their security budget is every year? I'm going to say it's probably less than the 93 or the 60 million they coughed out of pocket, you know, or even like 5-year security budget. So like, I think that from a ops network engineer point of view, we don't always necessarily, and I'm guilty of it too, we don't necessarily understand how that check is written or how much that check is. There's a lot of assumptions made on the importance of security, and it's a little bit of a disconnect from the technical to the business side, and that's always kind of been a problem.
Sure. Well, that's the whole point of, you know, the risk assessment, and what is the cost per record. You know, if we do have a breach, you know, is it $2,000 or $20,000 depending on your industry? I agree with that.
So we've started to tackle something that's probably a bit broader than what we can handle within our show time, and that's all of network security. It's all good. Maybe we should lead it back a little bit. So I mean, we've talked about different approaches. We've talked about different tools. I mean, ultimately, what's the right course of action? Like, if you're the network engineer and the primary person responsible for network security at, you know, a firm of, I don't know, a couple thousand people, you know, like what is it that you should be doing? Where should you be focusing? Should you be focusing at, you know, heuristic? Should you be focusing on the edge? Should you be focusing on the clients? Like, is it all of the above? All of the above? Like, so what is the you know, what's the takeaway? Like, if you were to give advice in, you know, and I'm gonna seriously limit you, 30 seconds to a minute, what do you say is the right course of action? Where should people be looking? Because I mean, you know, encryption's making it harder. What do we do?
Depending on the reason why you're doing it and your industry and the budget you have, you'll have to mix and match all of the above. So you may not have the ability to decrypt at every site, and you may have a requirement not to. So you'll have to take advantage of other tools to be able to assess threats or be able to assess, from an sd-wan perspective, what's a critical application based on IP and services. But essentially, there's no right answer or wrong answer for anyone. Covers everybody. It really just depends. Like a DoD versus like a manufacturing company are going to be two different things.
Yeah, the DoD is the one who's attacking us. And no, I'm sorry, I just devolved.
Whoa. Or financial institution versus a manufacturer.
There you go. Fair enough.
I'm surprised the stream didn't just get cut.
Yeah, I know. I'm waiting for that. I hear the drone outside.
I would say that decryption is a precision tool, and we can't treat it like it's a blunt instrument, right? So if you're going to do decryption, you got to know what traffic you're decrypting and why, and what you hope to gain from decrypting that traffic. But it wouldn't, if I were new in a security practice, it wouldn't be the first thing I would look at. I would want to understand, where is my outbound traffic going on the internet? Is it going to places that we don't do business with?
Well, I'm thinking that from a career perspective, get some skills because, these boxes are expensive. To put in, a visibility network parallel to your network is incredibly expensive. And then also the just having to learn how to configure all these things. So there are so many great free tools out there, but it requires you to know this stuff, this technology, what's going on. And so I personally think from a career perspective, so not from an operational perspective, is get some professional development and learn to code and learn what's going on at the packet level and take some courses. And then utilize a lot of those free things. I use a lot of really expensive stuff, but I still use like Nmap and Angry IP Scanner and Security Onion and all these things that are not, that are nothing, So.
All right. I think that's going to bring us to a close today. So first I want to say thanks to our guests. Thanks for coming on, chatting with us about encryption, and then diving into, security as a whole. Loved it. Also, thanks to all those of you who watched live, and also to those who are watching in the future. It's very time machine-esque. If you want to find out more about us, thenetworkcollective.com is where you can go. We have links to all of our other web profiles there. 2 weeks from now, we will be doing another episode, same time, same place. That episode, we're going to be continuing the conversation we started in episode 2, where we talked about choosing a routing protocol, and we're going to be diving in specifically in and around EIGRP and some of the practical considerations when using it. So we hope you'll join us then. Thanks a lot.